As you can see on the screen, we're going to do the ethics law. So if the open meeting law hasn't caused condemnation, the ethics law may.
My life has got very narrow.
All right, the ethics law is under NRS 281A, and you'll see that the public policy is very similar to the open meeting law. It's a public trust for the sole benefit of the people, and public officers must avoid conflicts of interest. So it sounds simple and straightforward, but it's kind of like the transparency statement from Madison. That's the goal. What's the details? So there's a duty to be informed about the ethics law, and you have to sign with the Ethics Commission when you filed for election or got approved for election. You had to file a form acknowledging that you will comply with the ethics law. I'm sure you did that form, or if you haven't yet, you will have to right away. And you file that acknowledgement with them, and then also the city has to inform any new hires about the ethics law. So everyone's on the same page. All right. So again, just like the public body definition, if you're created by the Constitution, state law, or ordinance, you exercise public power, trust, or duty, which I can't imagine any public official who is not exercising some level of public power, trust, or duty. Specifically, they listed the city manager in here, and this actually occurred because several school districts were hiring contract superintendents because they had difficulty recruiting them for some of these rural areas, so they hired them under a contract. And based on that, they wanted the ethics law to apply to those contractors. So it doesn't matter what form they take. If they have that public position of public trust, then the law is applicable to them. So who's not a public officer? Well, judge is excluded because there's different judicial ethics standards. A member of a board, commission, or other body that's advisory only. So they can be unethical, not unethical. They shouldn't. So as one law, you don't have to pay attention too much. No. And a member of a board of a GID or special district only if the duties do not include budget or expenditure approval. So they're basically saying, because the ethics law is focused on the pecuniary interest, that if you're in an advisory status, you don't have budgetary authority, then how can you violate the public trust in that sense by taking money? All right. So here's the list. You shall not seek or accept, and you just follow the bullet points, right? Gift, service, favor, employment, engagement, emolument, or economic opportunity for yourself or others to whom there's a commitment of capacity. So that's dynamite words, right? Potentially explosives. What does that commitment in a private capacity mean? See, when you write laws, there's nuances, interpretations, and legislative history. So that commitment in private capacity came out of an important case. That would tend improperly to influence the impartial discharge of your duties. So the goal is impartiality. That means no conflict of interest. And then we're going to go through the details of that. So you can't use your public position to negotiate for, secure, or grant unwarranted privileges. So take off, you can grant warranted privileges, but not unwarranted privileges, right? Preferences, exemptions, or advantages for yourself or any business entity in which he has a pecuniary interest or a commitment in a private capacity interest of another person. So that this commitment in a private capacity is equal to having an actual conflict. Because you're clouded in your judgment. Your judgment is not independent when your commitment is such that it's tantamount to you receiving the dough. Oops. Not accept any compensation for yourself or others to which there's a commitment in a private capacity from any private source for performing your public duties. So you work for a company and they say, we're going to pay you to be a city council member. Can't happen. You get paid by the taxpayer. Such an exorbitant compensation, I know. But you cannot bid contract with a public agency with whom you serve, except limited circumstances. And here with the situation, we had a contractor who was bidding on public jobs all the time, and he wasn't succeeding very often. So he decided to run for government, run for city council. His motivation for jobs. City staff told me that when I was coming out to do the training. Just be aware, we have this individual who was a contractor, who was unhappy getting jobs, and that's why he ran. And he thinks he's going to get more jobs. And I got to this slide, and he says, can I bid jobs? And I said, no, you can't. What's the limited circumstance? Is low bid limited circumstance? Nope, sorry. You have no other supplier in town except you. And nobody within a reasonable geographic distance to do that work besides you. Very limited. And I'm reminded of a school district that had one brother of a partnership who was on the school board, and they're a little small contracting deal, and there was this less than $1,000 or something like that. And they were a small community out the way. A larger community might have another contractor who could do that work. And so the board member wanted to know, what do I do? Well, first thing, I want you to keep this in mind, disclosure is your friend. So you have to disclose the conflict. I'm in partnership with my brother. He has the equipment to do this job, but I'm in partnership with him. I'm on the board, so I'm not going to be able to vote on this matter. I'll answer questions. I'll give information. But I'm not going to advocate or anything. I'm not going to support this issue. I'm just going to tell you, here's the job, here's the capabilities. And then he went one step further. He said, I will step out of the room and you can have an independent discussion. So that's what he did. Those were limited circumstance situations. But you're in a big area. You got lots of people who can do these jobs. So it's going to be rare that you'll have that limited circumstance. All right. You shall not use information that's not available to the public to further your own self-interest. So you get, as council members, you will get information from proposals that are not yet public. You can't use that to take advantage of it, go and get a deal for yourself. So in other words, let's say there's a report to your attention that a developer is proposing something to come into town and do something. And you see an opportunity and you run out and buy a parcel adjacent so you can take advantage of that deal. Or on the converse, you get a report that there's an environmental hazard on adjacent to certain property and you own one of those parcels. And so you sell it before that information becomes public. So that's taking advantage of your information that's now out there to the public in order to further your own pocket. And the same goes for any commitment in the private capacity to the interest of another. So one of your buddies that you have a connection to, and we'll talk about those connections. So the second example, the pollution example, is an example of suppressing government information. In other words, hiding it from the public so you can take advantage of it. So both are prohibited. This next one resulted in impeachment of a state official using governmental time, property, equipment, or other facility to benefit significant personal interest. In this case, it was Kathy Augustine. She was running for re-election. She ordered her staff to do campaign materials for her, to do other campaign activities for her while she was in office. So these were her own public staff that were supposed to do the public's business she was doing for herself. It was investigated. She was impeached and then convicted and removed from office for doing this. Unfortunately, she met a timely death for a wholly different reason, but that had to do with being murdered by her ex. But she was removed from office for this violation. So what is excessive use of public time or property? So if I needed to make a copy of something as say an employee, I needed to make a copy of something. I don't have a copier at home. Could I use the city copier? Well, I could if I paid for that usage, perhaps. But suppose what I wanted was a manuscript for a book that I was going to sell, and I needed 100 copies of my 1,000-page book. Is that misuse of government property or time? Probably so. Especially if I gave it to the city clerk and it took priority. Over any other city business. No, so that's, again, or doing it for my best buddy author who wrote that 1,000-page book. He can self-publish on the internet anyway, so I don't know why we do that. But anyway. Shall not use your official position to benefit personal pecuniary interest or contracts for yourself or others to which there's a commitment in a private capacity. And this is the case that arose. It's called Mike Kerrigan, City of Sparks, former council member. And he had a buddy that had been his campaign manager for 25 years, never charged him for it. And a council item came up that was to the council. And when he proposed it, the council member asked the city attorney if he could vote on the matter. And the city attorney at the time said, yes, because there's no money, there's no exchange, he's not doing. But there was this underlying issue of commitment in a private capacity. Are you objective? 25-year campaign manager relationship, can you be objective about that as a council member? That was the fundamental problem. The city attorney's advice was in conflict with Ethics Commission's prior opinions, because they'd made an opinion on that. So what that does under the ethics law is if you got a legal advice that was consistent with prior opinions, then it wouldn't be a willful violation, it would be a violation though. So either way, he appealed that determination, lost, appealed to Nevada Supreme Court, lost, appealed to the US Supreme Court, and lost. and it was remanded back to the Nevada Supreme Court to finish off the case. So the commitment in a private capacity is tantamount to having a pecuniary interest, meaning you cannot be objective, and it's doing a favor for your buddy, benefits your buddy. That's the same as if it benefited you. If that commitment is such that it clouds your judgment, you cannot be independent. So it's a Kerrigan case. Selling goods and service to the public. It's the same as the contracting example. Again, unless you're a sole source, which is very unlikely in Boulder City that you would have a sole source because of the geography and the proximity to other communities. But if you did, then that's possible. But full disclosure must be made, and there must be an objective determination, and you cannot vote on that matter because of your self-interest. Okay? If you're in the role of a business agent or an attorney representing a client and you're a council member, when that client comes before the council, you are a council member and you cannot advocate on behalf of that client as a council member. So you have to disclose and recuse under those circumstances. Same with a business manager for an operation like that. So sometimes you have dual roles, you have to be careful there. They also have a provision that says you can't do it within this geographic to other government agencies because of your elected official position. So you pretty much have to stop doing public business within the county in those circumstances when you're representing others. And this last one is you shall not spend funds to support or oppose a ballot question or a candidate. This created an interesting dilemma. Churchill County had a 3-member board and they put a ballot measure on to increase it to 5. And then the question became, how do we inform the public about the pros and cons of the 5-member board versus 3? So what they could do is they could do public issues forum. So they met in the city or in the county commission chambers, they met in the senior center, other public places, and they just had an open forum and the public can ask questions. They had to be careful not to advocate or spend advertising dollars or anything that would support the ballot question that they wanted the people to vote on. So they had to walk this fine line of information disclosure but not advocacy. And it didn't pass, so there's still 3.
Okay, going back to the meeting law, so the 3 members of the council are giving information to the public. How does that not become a meeting? How does that?
It is a meeting.
It is a meeting.
They had to
have an agenda, they had to follow that.
Yeah, it was an informational meeting to the public, so no action was taken, but they still had to follow the same open meeting law.
Because there's deliberation or decision
Right.
that could come out of it.
Potentially, even if it's discussion only, it's still required to be noticed because it's a quorum, the board is present.
So, I just want to clarify, in your opinion then, if the council has a policy of having town hall meetings that are led by a council member, particular issue, a council member has a meeting on, here's how we're going to make creeks greener. Other council members want to listen, but is that
That's a potential presence and deliberation toward a decision, so it has that issue potential.
potential because of a potential exchange that could impact the board?
Right. But under the ethics law, you can't spend money to advocate. All right. So I said disclosure was your friend. So the disclosure has to be sufficient to inform the public of the potential effect of the action or abstention. So I can't just start at the beginning of my term and say, I may have a conflict of interest someday, somehow, so just be warned. No, it has to be specific enough on that agenda item at the time that item's being considered. So the public has to understand what the real conflict is, okay? So at your council meeting, every time an issue comes up, look at the agenda before the meeting and flag whenever you think you might have a conflict on that agenda item in terms of your pecuniary interest, your money effect or your commitment in private capacity, right? To the interest of others. And see, and that's where even on the social media discussion, is there a commitment in private capacity to that private group? Possibly. So again, look at this in sense of two things: my money interest and my ability to be objective because I've not maintained a commitment to any private interest sufficient to equate to a financial interest. So your disclosure has to be public. So like I said with the school board member, he disclosed in public what his conflict was, and then he had to not vote and not participate. All right. So you shall not approve, disapprove, vote, abstain, or act, or advocate passage or failure. But you can talk about it. I tell you about this fine line happened to the former legislator who was an attorney who had a client who had a project that the legislature was involved with. It was a pier at Lake Tahoe. And he got up to explain the project and the legislation that was proposed and disclosed it was his client, so he did that. So he had all that stuff on the record. And then he proceeded to give the information, and the newspaper interpreted that as advocacy. And so they filed a complaint that he was advocating for his client, and that was a conflict of interest as a legislator. And he argued vigorously that he was just providing information. So you see how it can get you in trouble. So what does somebody perceive providing information versus advocacy? In my example here, a planning commission member who was a mobile home dealer. And the only way he can get a mobile home sale concluded was if the planning commission approved it, right? So they had to grant the permit, but he was on the commission. So you can see there was an inherent ethical conflict. And so he always disclosed, but he was always, and he didn't vote, but he was nervous that the perception, and so here's why I look at it and say, okay, you're participating by giving them information about the customer and the site and all those things are required. And when you're doing that, are you arguing for the customer? It's difficult because you could be saying this is, all these good things about this thing. So in a sense, he's an advocate if he says anything. But the law says you can participate in providing information as long as you don't advocate. So it's a fine line. So what I advised him to do, I said, take one step further. Just tell him, here's the permit, it's my customer, I'm in conflict, I'm just disclosing that I have a pecuniary interest. I will not vote on this matter. The application's in the packet, in the information. If you have questions, I will answer your specific questions. And then I'm going to step out of the room. Because what he was worried about, and what I told him he needed to be careful of, was if a council member started, or a planning commission member started asking questions, and even if he was sitting in the back of the room and he said, make body language, is that advocacy? It could be. So I said, it's probably best to step out of the room and leave it up to them to have discussion of everything they want. Because otherwise, you could be misperceived as advocating, which would be a violation. So then it goes on any matter in which the independence of judgment of a reasonable person. Now, do you know any reasonable people? Not a one. Reasonable person are your peers. So here you are, you're all reasonable people in the public, right? So you got to look at, there's a reasonableness standard. By his acceptance of a gift or loan, significant pecuniary interest or commitment in a private capacity. So again, this goes back to the Kerrigan case, that commitment in a private capacity, the interest of others, not just relatives, not just friends, but people that have been around with you long enough to have that influence your impartiality.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What about like a realtor on a planning commission? I mean, good question.
If it's his customer, if it's that realtor's customer, or that realtor's project, there's going to disclosure certainly is the minimum. And if they stand to make any gain, pecuniary gain, or they can't be objective because somebody else is presenting, then they've got to not vote and recuse themselves. And they probably be advised to step away from that meeting. So it's difficult. They have knowledge, it's useful on a planning commission, certainly.
Planning commission is basically.
Exactly. But it's when their customer is at issue, or their project is at issue, that's where it starts getting difficult. So you can give information without doing body language advocacy or any other form, but then ultimately you've got to say, I have a conflict, I can't vote on this particular one. Now they can vote on other projects, but it creates that dynamic. So you have to be very careful when you're in that role to be vigilant about your conflicts. Yeah.
So kind of be clear, or at least for clarity, if there's a general project, there shouldn't be an issue, correct? In other words, let's say general project is coming into the city. Obviously, as a realtor, you may have eventual interests, but that shouldn't prevent them from participating correctly.
Yeah, and the example there is if the detriment or benefit is to everyone equally, you disclose the potential, but if it's beneficial equally, then you can still vote. You're not conflicted out because everybody's, same with business license fees. You raise business license fees and you have a business. Every business is going to be affected equally. You disclose that I have a business license, this will affect me.
Disclosure I've deferred, that would mean if there's something to do with it.
Yep, at every time there's an item that addresses that subject that you're affected by. So if it's general affecting everybody, then disclose and you can still vote. But if it's unique to you, you're the only business in this category, and you're going to reduce license fees because you're not usually going to get in trouble for increasing them, but either one works, then you can't vote in that case. Yeah.
As you were explaining this up until what you just said, I was appointed to the Airport Advisory Committee, and it's comprised of 5 people, which were all pretty much hangar owners or renters, and we're now negotiating hangar leases. And so obviously, immediately I was thinking, well, I can't even participate in this, but then as, just for clarification of what you just said, because we're negotiating a lease that will affect everybody equally, that is the caveat that says, okay, I can participate?
Yeah, you have to disclose.
I have to disclose.
And if the lease agreement is going to be the same for everyone, the same lease rates and no special favors, it's all objective criteria and you fall into it, you disclose the specific conflict that you have. But say because it's a general application, then I'm disclosing, but I will be able to participate in the vote.
So,
Yeah.
let me just clarify, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking about how do I couch this particular scenario? And that is, the council, as you had said before, can create bodies and delegate certain responsibilities, as an example, the Airport Advisory Committee, whereby typically, because of the technical nature, you tend to have individuals that are nominated and appointed into that committee because of their technical expertise. And oftentimes it's because they know the business because they're out there, as an example, the Airport Advisory Committee, these folks that typically have aircraft and they're leasing and so forth. So those leases are not with the city, necessarily that you're leasing from as be with one of the committee members because they happen to be the owner of the building, but we're negotiating with you as the owner of the building, not as the committee member. And ultimately, it's the staff that is bringing forward those recommendations to the council to adopt, new lease agreements, new terms, that sort of thing. But the deliberation that is going on with the advisory committee in terms of giving advice to, and including staff about what you think rates ought to be, terms and conditions and whatnot, that's where it gets into that little shade of gray where even it makes, quite honestly, your city manager a little uncomfortable because you're appointed because of your expertise, but yet could you be benefiting, particularly if you are the owner of those hangars, because not everybody that potentially could be a member would have that conflict. But your 5 is because of how the committee was structured and because we want the technical expertise. It happens to be that the 5 members that are appointed are the 5 members that have aircraft and or hangars or own the hangars. And that we in the council inherently created that conflict. And maybe not everybody would benefit because you may not necessarily individually or collectively be looking out at the interests of all of the potential owners of the hangars.
Yeah,
So it is a dilemma.
It is, and that's why you have to be careful. But if the lease agreement is standard across anyone who leases a hangar, the standard terms, the standard rates, your job is to disclose that you're one of those hangar owners or users, and under the terms of the lease, and then you can still vote because the lease is the same no matter who it is. The lease rate's the same no matter who it is. It's when you have something special or an exception that you may not be able to vote.
One other quick member on the commission, I don't know, whatever, and another potential, either an individual interest or even this potential for a project where they should disclose and they don't disclose. How should that other member handle it?
I think
are they party to the problem if there was one?
if you're aware of it, you can find it, and then it's their job to choose to disclose. And if somebody doesn't like what's going on, they're going to challenge them under the ethics law. And just like with the open meeting law, there are penalties for violations. So it's just better to just gently remind them, you probably need disclosure. Because I had some situations where somebody said, I can just disclose the meeting because there's several items. No, it has to be done each time. But that's a lot. Well, sorry, that's what's going to happen. So, yeah.
On the realtor, in Scottswood, the golf course. Now, all the a lot of money. 200 houses, 200 sales, 3%. I mean, is that ethical?
Well, it depends on who they're approving and what is their pecuniary interest in the decision they're making. And again, if it's going to benefit equally,
How does that benefit the other citizens having 200 more houses over there?
that's again a discussion at the time is what is your pecuniary interest? If you're the real estate agent that's going to benefit uniquely on that, then of course there's a conflict. But if you're just one of the many realtors that are in town that could wind up with an opportunity,
Well, that's a catch-22, isn't it?
it is. It's potential. The potential's there, but you've got to go through that. You got to go through that analysis and disclose at a minimum, and then make an independent decision whether you need to recuse. Because if you can't be objective, then you probably shouldn't vote on the matter. And if that means go to a different body to make the ultimate decision, then the advisory group may want to just buck it to a different body, the city council, to do that.
And one thing, there's a difference, I think, and John, and somehow I'm speaking here, but if the members of the advisory committee may potentially have in the future, they really have to have some sort of a real net in the scenario that's being painted here, there's potentially 200 lots that could become available. Doesn't mean that just because I happen to be a realtor that I'm going to be the one that's going to get the contract to sell lots, for future homes. It could actually go to somebody else. I just happen to be one of 200. But you could disclose, hey, I'm a realtor and I may, I'm going to put my bid in the future, but you're not doing it now. So you don't have the conflict immediately, but later on in the future, you could potentially participate in that after that decision has been made.
Yeah, and again, is there a commitment where you're not objective on this whole thing, where you are going to benefit or your buddies are going to benefit because your commitment is not, impairs your judgment. Objective, it's the impairment of the independence of judgment of a reasonable person. So if there were non-realtors making the decision, they would be the reasonable person and would have more likely have complete independence, but they may benefit because they may buy that property. So that's always a dilemma that you have to carefully analyze before you jump in and say, I can vote. And recognize that it's just somebody could challenge it, you could argue against it, and you may win. But it's when that pecuniary interest or that commitment is such that it impairs the judgment of a reasonable person under the same circumstances. So you better look around. Would these people make the same decision without a conflict? So ethics is always subjective.
I mean, we just changed all our incumbents because we felt that was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so again, just be careful out there, as they say. All right, here's this commitment, interest, or relationship. Here's what it includes. The spouse, domestic partner, member of the household, domestic partnership within the third degree of consanguinity. Third degree, so we'll look at that. Your employer, your spouse, your domestic partner's employer, or household member's employer, anyone with whom you have a substantial and continuing business relationship, and anyone with whom you have any other commitment that is substantially similar relationship to those listed up there. And this was the Kerrigan case. Substantially similar relationship to having a business partner, even though it was not a financial transaction. He could not be objective. I was out in a small community. We actually had boards together in one town. We were doing this training. And the only dentist in this one community was the dental provider for all the school district employees and fellow board members, So if his contract came up for dentistry, everyone's conflicted, right? The most important thing is he couldn't participate in that decision. And the contract would benefit everyone equally. So he had to disclose and then not vote. Okay, so that's the kind of situation you have there. All right, here's your consanguinity chart. Go out to the 3rd degree. So you put yourself in the yellow box and go out 3. And you can see your first cousins thrice removed are in the 3rd degree. I have challenged people to fill out this entire chart, and I haven't found anybody. Nobody has said they could, but it's kind of interesting. But clearly, you know, aunts and uncles and that sort of thing on down. So, all right. So here's another way of looking at it. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree. Just a different configuration might be easier to understand it from this, because that one, the other one had like 6 degrees, 8 degrees or whatever. All right, pecuniary interest is benefit or detriment involved is measured in or related to money, economic value or payment of money owed by law. So then, as I said, you may vote after disclosure if the interest is the same for everyone affected by this decision, even though you have a pecuniary interest. But if you're the unique party, then you disclose and may not vote. And in some cases, you may even want to leave the room to avoid the argument of undue influence through active body language, like, hold on. All right. So now they could talk about the independent judgment. It's not affected if the benefit or detriment is no greater than anybody else affected by this decision. If it would be affected, you shall not vote or advocate passage, but you may participate, so be careful how you participate. And the disclosure has to be sufficient for the public to understand the conflict. Okay? So here's what the Ethics Commission does. If there's a violation alleged, then their job is to investigate that, which means gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, people that may have knowledge of this thing. Any time there's a non-compliance, they would inform either the Attorney General or the District Attorney for possible prosecution. They conduct hearings on requests for an opinion, and they do render decisions. So if you are concerned about a future conflict, you could ask for a formal Ethics Commission opinion based on your description of those parameters. And you got to be pretty clear on that to make sure they get a thorough enough information to make a determination. They also recommend legislation, and as I said, we're going to make a bunch of changes to this, but it didn't go through this session, so it may go through next session, because I think they were just caught up in some political wrangling over one portion of the proposed change, and it died. And they do publish an ethics law manual, and by the way, the open meeting law manual is on the AG's website, and the ethics manual is on the Ethics Commission's website. So when they do the review, they do a staff review first, and they do investigation, and if they think there's a violation potential, then they do a formal hearing process, and ultimately it can be a determination, if you don't like the outcome, can be appealed to the district court. Now what we do for our members, government officials, is we will provide an attorney to defend the ethics allegation. We don't pay the fine if you get tagged for violating, but at least you have representation assisting you. So we'll reimburse those legal costs. All right. Under the previous legislative session, they got authority to issue a letter of caution so they can tell you you've got to go take some ethics training, or you got to be publicly admonished on the record for your violation of conflict. So they can do things like that. And they can issue a deferral agreement, which was interesting because that was an expansion of their powers. It allowed them to say, enter in an agreement with you that after you complete certain ethics training, then we'll remove the fine, that kind of an agreement. So that's all possible. Or they may ask you to make a public apology for your violation. They may order you to do that. So there's some choices they have other than just hitting you with a fine or turning you over to the district attorney. But here's the fines. $5,000 for the first willful violation. $10,000 for a second, $25,000 for a third, and $5,000 for a person who interferes. And this is why I put it in bold, if a financial gain occurred, an additional penalty of up to and it was information you got behind the scenes, and you went and bought that lot, and then you benefited by selling that lot, you got a gain of $100,000. You know, up to 2 times that could be your penalty for the ethics violation on top of the initial willful. So there's some real teeth in the ethics law. And then if there's willful violations, that's subject to potential impeachment. They can actually remove you from office. That's a district court action. And again, it's not willful if you got legal counsel advice, if the advice was not contrary. Now see, this is not changed from like the open meeting law. This is still, he's got to look at prior opinions to verify how the Ethics Commission has ruled on this subject matter to get you out of a willful. Doesn't mean you won't be subject to a non-willful violation, but to get out of the willful, not only must he give you advice, but it has to be consistent with the prior opinions. So I don't know if the proposed legislation changed that, but it's still the law on the ethics currently. So here's a tool that you can use to kind of keep this ethics in front of your mind. It's from the ethics resource, or ethics.org, and I thought it was useful. Ethical decision, there's 4 filters they mention. It's kind of an acronym plus. Policy, legal, universal, and self. So policy ethics is, you know, what does your own city policies say about ethics? Legal, what does the law say? Universal is what does the community think is ethical behavior? And 4th is self. So if somebody approached you, handed you a promotional pen, that's a self issue more likely, or a community issue, depending on the value of the pen. So it becomes subjective, right? So if it's a gold pen worth a couple $1,000 and they're trying to get a deal done, you got to look at it, apply these principles. If it's a $2 pen, is that really going to improperly influence your objectivity? For most of us, probably not. So the legislature, in its wisdom, decided that any gift over $2 value or $10 in the aggregate in a legislative session must be disclosed on their forms. So guess what happened? Nobody gave gifts. So the only thing the lobbyists could do would be to throw parties where they invited all the legislators to come. So then the legislators didn't have a conflict in that circumstance. Whereas before, they would take them to dinner. And then the questions always arose, is that unethical? So if you apply these principles, it then helps you just use that plus. So here's the way to do it. Step 1, you define the problem, and then you say, is there a policy, legal, universal, or self-ethics issue here? Right? And then you identify the alternatives, and then from the alternatives, is there a policy, legal, universal, or self-ethics issue here? Then you make your decision and implement it, and then when it's implemented, you evaluate that decision. Again, did we accomplish the result ethically? So you just remember those plus principles as you're looking at agenda items and you're thinking about your own conflicts. Disclose plus legal. Is there any issue that I need to be concerned with? Okay? So the law is clear and difficult to interpret because it's gray. It's clear you'll get in trouble and it's substantial fine and cost. So it's clear that you need to be careful and always disclose with enough specificity. That's your first protection and specific to each item, okay? And follow the law and make sure always your personal goals are subordinate to the public. What happens to your pocketbook or your friend doesn't matter. It's the public's business.
Who are you allowed to accept gifts from and who are you not allowed to accept gifts from?
Well, you have to say is if there's a gift that would tend to improperly influence your impartiality, don't accept it.
Let's say,
Doesn't matter who it's from.
right, so say like a birthday gift from, my family or my best friend, that would not be considered unacceptable.
If they're intending to influence your impartiality, it would be a problem. But if they're not, then it's not going to be an issue.
So I'm a musician, performing artist, so a lot of the work that I do is kind of atypical, and a lot of the compensation for that work is also atypical. Not food, beverage, things like that. It is in compensation for the work I'm doing, but that's not always what that compensation is going to be like at the end of the evening. I don't always know, so there's kind of this ebb and flow. There's a lot of handshakes, obviously bigger events, there's contracts and things like that, but there's a lot of gray in that, how that even ends up looking. What do I need to be sure to look for in that?
Yeah, what we know about most musicians, and I'm one too, is they're not making a tremendous living off doing music.
Yeah.
It's a dicey living at best. Again, you just keep the focus on what is the goal of this
Gotcha.
relative to my city council work. If it has no relevance to the city council work, make a living. You're entitled to. The public doesn't expect you to do it for free. Yeah.
Can the council establish a policy that establishes, I think, thresholds for acceptance of simple gifts like pens, whatever, or lunches, dinners?
If the council wants to do that, they could create an ethics policy, but I'll assure you there's going to be lots of debate over what's the threshold, what's the influence, especially when it gets to this commitment in private capacity, because there is no dollar. That's an attitude. Yeah.
Okay, here's a hypothetical situation. My husband flies airplanes recreationally but does not own one, and a friend of his says, yeah, you can come by and fly my airplane, and then something comes up in terms of the airport.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that I need to disclose, that situation arose, or that does arise.
Yeah, it may be a simple matter of disclosure,
Okay.
and you may still be able to vote. But it's because it's an issue before the council to make a decision on, then you're safer to disclose.
That's safe.
And again, the decision may be the same across the board, and if that's
Right.
the case, then you can disclose and vote.
Judgment of whether it's something that is
Right.
across the board to anybody who owns an airplane or a hangar or whatever.
Yeah, and if he's getting some special privilege that the city's going to have to address, then you may not be able to vote in that instance, but you have to disclose no matter what. Okay? Yes?
If, excuse me, you just run into council member, at lunch, you're walking into a restaurant, they're maybe already sitting down, but they're by themselves, you go over and sit down with them. Is there anything, I have no business that anything I'm doing will ever come before the council for any reason, just as a friend type of thing or somebody you know, is there anything wrong with them letting me buy their lunch? I mean, I'm not ever going to have anything that's gonna come before the council or influence, nor is my family.
Well, you're not in trouble. He is.
Would he?
The council member could be, depending upon the perception and depending on the facts of the situation if something did come up. So just like the commitment in the private capacity, just like the pecuniary interest, if that's going to influence improperly the independence of judgment of that council member, then they must disclose, and they may or may not be able to vote depending on the circumstances. So it's okay, but they have to be careful. That's the problem with trying to define in a policy format exactly what the rules are, because you could inadvertently, and so that's why a lot of legislators, if they go to lunch with a lobbyist, they buy their own lunch. Just to be clear, but it's not required, but it must be disclosed. And if they're voting on a matter for that constituent that bought their lunch, and it would have their impartiality would have been adversely affected, then they shouldn't vote. They should disclose and not vote. So it all gets into that little muddy area. So welcome to public business. All right. So there's a leadership test that's been around, and I just inserted the word ethical in it. So is it the right time and ethical time? Is it the right place, ethical place, the right reason, or ethical reason, so forth? The goal is to keep ethics forefront in your decision making, and just keep reminding yourself of that. So that's another way to look at it. And then Cyril Huell has written a number of books for nonprofits governance, and he wrote this one: the board is ultimately judged by how effectively, and I just inserted, and ethically, it achieves the mission of the institution. So if you think about it, your legacy is about effective governance, right? But you also want it ethical. So you can accomplish a lot unethically, and you could accomplish a lot ethically. And I think I would be on the side of accomplishing with ethics as well. So now we're going to our last one. We'll try to race through this because I know the time is late, because we had a good discussion on open meeting. I kind of anticipated that one would be more extensive because it's new law change. So, if we got, there we are. Okay, so successful government. I'm their leader. Which way did they go? You got elected. Now you're on the council, and where are the folks supporting the issue as you're addressing and wrestling with all the competing interests and alternatives, right? So just remember, you're on your way. So where did they go? So now, first thing you have to do is cope with that fact, that election. You used to be one of us, the people. Congratulations, you are the government now. And I know there's a lot of things about that we have feelings about that, about the federal government level sometimes. But here's local, and it's the same situation. You were one of the people, now you're the government. People expect things out of you. They expect that you know what the heck you're doing because you paid attention. And you may have gone to a few city council meetings in the past as a public speaker or whatever. You may have watched them on the public access TV. You may have done all kinds of things to try to get to know the operations of the city. But the public's perception is you got elected, so do stuff. And you suddenly sit in this council seat and say, whoa, wait a minute, there's other alternatives here. There's other constraints here, right? So that's the first thing, is get used to that. And this last bullet point I credit to the former mayor of Salt Lake City who spoke at the Nevada League of Cities conference a few years ago, and he says there's only 3 things you have to get right as a council member: people, potholes, and poop. People is the public you serve and the employees you serve. That's your people. So that's easy, just get that right. Don't offend the public and treat your employees well. That always is a goal. Potholes are the day-to-day things that happen. You know, the regular stuff that happens, the city manager gets those calls, the staff gets those calls constantly, and it's stuff you gotta fix, the potholes out there in the street or whatever. Those are the day-to-day things. You should have policies and procedures that manage those things because they're routine. And then poop is when you've got that emergency meeting. You've got that unusual circumstance when stuff has hit the fan and all of a sudden you have to have an operation, all hands on deck. So again, your emergency plans will help with that. But not every plan doesn't cover every circumstance. And there's a term by Nassim Taleb, who was an author who wrote a book called Swan. And the reason that term existed is nobody had ever seen a black swan, only white ones, until they went to Australia and all of a sudden there's black swans. But a black swan is something that's unusual, that's unanticipated, and probably unknowable that it was going to happen. So even your best plans may not anticipate those kind of circumstances. But that's why it's important to have a plan where you brainstorm and come up with as many of those as you can. All right. So the other thing that's happened to you on your council role, your committee role, is you used to be in charge of yourself. You used to be in your private role. Maybe you were an operating supervisor or employee who took direction. But now you're on the policy-making side. And that means there's 5 voices on the council, all talking with ideas of their own, all talking at once sometimes. And you got to bring them together. You got to come together, because that's when you have a voice, is when that vote is taken, right? That's your voice. That's the voice of the board. We got to look at all these alternatives. We got to be cautious and considerate because there's so many alternatives out there and impacts that may be good for some of the cities, not so good for others, but you got to weigh all that stuff out. So you're going to have to be careful, and you're going to have to decide what are the facts, because everybody has an opinion, and some people present opinions as if they're facts, and they're not. So you got to sort all that stuff out. So that results in speaking with one voice. That speaking with one voice is the vote of the board. That is the board's decision. And as I mentioned earlier, you got to be careful when you're in the minority vote on an issue to recognize that it's still the council's decision. And it does you no good in your relationships with fellow board members to go out of that meeting and say, well, I didn't vote for that. You didn't have to. We go by majority rules. So it's still my decision as a council member because I'm sworn to uphold the laws and policies of the council, even when I disagree. And that's how democracy functions, and it's very difficult decisions sometimes. But yet it's important to understand that, as I mentioned, you don't have any power individually, but that's your power, that one voice. So there's your task to oversee the city on behalf of the people. You're not tasked with doing the day-to-day jobs. You're not tasked with going out and repairing the potholes. But you are tasked with allocating the budget, the funds, to meet the city's needs for the people. So I've learned from dealing with foreign entities, and we've been running the insurance pool since 1987. I started it with the legislative process in '85. We got it passed unanimously, and we launched it in '87. So I've seen a lot of government functions, good, bad, and indifferent, all over the state. And I can tell you it goes in cycles, sometimes at this part of the state, sometimes there's always dysfunction. It moves around, and then there's great stuff that happens too. So overall, the people are served well. But I found that when you have a positive approach to governance, you as a council will operate better and feel better, and the people will be better served than when you allow it to slide into dysfunction and dissent. So that's the goal. One of the things you can do is to learn how you communicate. In other words, some of us are visual, so we like this kind of stuff. Some of us are auditory oriented, where we like to hear a discussion. And some of us actually want to go walk the site. That's the kinesthetic. And we all have elements of this, but there's a dominant style that we tend to have. So you need to know yourself. How do you want to get prepared for your council decisions? Do you need a briefing? Or can you just read the documents and be satisfied? Or do you need to say, I need a briefing in the field, walking the site of the project so I understand it? So just understand yourself and then get to know your fellow council. Look at your style, and I don't pay attention. I might be talking visual language, and you're an auditory. So I'm saying, do you see what I'm saying? And you're saying, I don't hear anything. And this happens with everyone. The closer the relationship, the more often there's opportunity for misunderstanding those kinds of things. All right. So discover each other to get that understanding. So try to figure out what each of you needs, and instead of talking Spanish speaker, talk in Spanish. All right. So let's look at the dysfunctional board, give you some examples. And this is learning to balance reality and unreality, and this is the kind of get you into how to be. Some of the dysfunctions I've seen are power struggles. So the chair of the board says, call me your excellency. So when the mayor says, call me your excellency, he's asserting a little extra power. There's one individual or subgroup in control of the board. So it's not a board as a team. It's a sub-elements of the board that create power struggle. Lack of civility or respect. That is why that article was written. But if it's let's get ready to rumble, then it's likely a dysfunction going on in the board. Where you expect a fight, you're likely to get one. And here's where your own internal language will help modify that. Because if you're thinking about your fellow board members in a positive way, you're more likely to treat them positively than the other. Chair can't maintain order. I've only seen this a few times, but there was one instance where it was a public commenter that kept badgering the chair, and he wouldn't let go. And the issue he wanted the county commission, in this case, to address was a city issue. The county had no jurisdiction, and the chair could not convince him that it wasn't their issue, and he just kept going and going and going, and finally she lost it and gavelled and get out. So there's some difficulty. But when it happens with a council member or a commission member, that's when it's even more awkward. And here we had a situation with 3 members, and one member started going off on a tangent about this federal issue that the county had no jurisdiction over whatsoever, but it was a political rant, and he kept going, and the chair, she said, it's enough, you gotta stop, we don't have any jurisdiction over this, we gotta move on. We got the rest of the agenda. And he said, I will not stop, and he just kept going. She finally asked the attorney, he says, does he have to stop if I tell him? He said, yep. And he still wouldn't do it. So she hit the gavel and recessed the meeting, which is the appropriate response. And then if he wanted to continue his rant, the public could stay or not stay. So it becomes an issue. Or if open meeting means I already made up my mind, don't bother me with the information or facts. I don't want to consider the alternatives. I've already made up my mind. That's not an open meeting. You're mentally not open. So you want to make sure you maintain. Or you get a council member who says deliberation means I tell everyone what to do and they follow me because I'm big and important. Okay, that's another problem. I talk, you listen, right? Another one is preoccupied with procedure. And we'll go through briefly a little bit of Robert's rules, but the law doesn't require you to follow Robert's rules, but a lot of folks do. General follow them. But when you start getting into rule disputes, this is subpart page 800. Believe it or not, Robert's Rules of Order started out as about a 2-page, 800 now. So you don't want to follow it completely, all right? But the hidden agenda where control is a goal, that's another form of dysfunction on the board. And here's probably the one that gets in trouble from time to time. It doesn't matter with what kind of organization, but sometimes the problem with policy versus operation is it gets fuzzy. Policy. And it's easier for most of us to understand operations than it is to wrestle with policy. This policy requires slow thinking. And slow thinking means you gotta noodle over something about nuances, you gotta look at, fine-tuned language, and it's not as exciting as approving a project or walking a project or doing something like that. But you can get into control battles. So I'm in charge, can't you tell? Another one, and I've seen this a few times, and it was really damaging, micromanaging, spying on staff. We had a situation where some new candidates for council put together, and the public found out about it, they put together a list, a hit list of people they wanted to get rid of in the city if they got elected. And it was the city manager, the finance director, the clerk, the business license person. I mean, it went on down the line. They had a dozen people on their list. And they got elected. So there was clearly a potential problem going on. And one of the early actions they started doing was the council members and their supporters who got them elected started coming to this parking lot. And at 8 o'clock in the morning when the people were supposed to show up to work, they were photographing the license plate of the employee that was coming to work. They were checking on him, spying on him. Started intimidating the employees. In fact, one of the employees asked whether they could file an injunction to stop them from doing this. Well, problem is, if you're in a public parking lot, which this was, parking for public and employees, anyone can take a picture of anybody. So they really couldn't get an injunction to stop them from doing it. And then they started going after the city manager, got rid of him first, and the finance director, and they were really influencing adversely. And so a lot of people were very nervous. And there was this micromanagement that created this dysfunction. Because the city had been running fine from what our side could see, what we could see externally. The manager wasn't a problem, the finance director wasn't a problem, but they created this kind of disruption within the city, and so it became very dysfunctional. So let's look at positive governance. And there's some bullet points here I just want to hit a couple of them. Lead or get out of the way. Sometimes you have a rank and file employee who's leading and just needs to be supported. So don't get in the way and think you have to be in charge because you're at a higher level, right? Let them lead if that's what they're capable of doing and they're doing it well. Sometimes you just got to get out of the way. Other times you got to step in and lead because they don't have the support that they need in order to get the job done. This fourth bullet point, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Anybody know where that came from?
St. Francis of Assisi.
Actually, it was Stephen Covey in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, whether he stole it from St. Francis, I don't know.
I thought it was part of the prayer of St. Francis.
Okay.
It sounds good to me.
Yeah. This, to me, the most important thing for a council member to focus on is, do I understand the issue before I spew my point of view? Do I understand? What are the alternatives? What are the other points of view before I make up my mind, right? So I think it's an important habit for council members to get in mind is seek first to understand, then to be understood, how you interpret it, okay? So there's certain responsibilities you have adopting a vision and mission. You're acting as trustees. You're holding the taxpayers' funds, and they trust you until they don't. And then this election problem, right? You set the governing policies. You assure the managers that fiduciary role, and you have a strategic plan. Now, to me, the strategic plan is at the bottom, and these other are steps toward achieving the vision and mission. And the vision is where you want to be. The mission is why you exist as a city. What's the purpose of the city? And where's the city going to be? Beyond your term. So look out, 10 years down the road, not just to the balance of your term. Your strategic plan is simply a ladder to get to the vision. So that's why it's important to go back through the plan and think about what are my alternatives? What is it going to take to get there? And if the plan is, you had a discussion on the swimming pool, right? On whether to replace it, and you had a vote on it. If you had a strategic plan and it said it's going to take X million dollars, and you had a plan that said within 10 years, and we're going to collect this each year, and this is the goal, and this is how we're going to do it, and you put that in your strategic plan, and it's there consistently and regularly, you have a vision laid out, you're more likely to achieve that than if you just throw something out there. So there's a lot of things, decisions you make that could support your vision, and you just have to think about what are the steps to get there down the road. So there's some duties, and there's also some help, if you will. First is the duty of care, and that's the prudent person. So what would a prudent person do under the same circumstances? Well, prudent people are right here in this room and in other citizen communities. Loyalty, that's the ethics law in a nutshell. Your best interests of the organization, no conflicts. And obedience is following the law and then being willing to reject proposals that put your mission at risk. And I look to the legislature and the decision on subsidies for Tesla and Faraday Futures and those kind of things, saying they're giving away tax revenue for 20 years, betting that it'll pay off between now and then, and they'll still be able to have a state that functions. So that's the kind of thing they had to be willing to say no. And hopefully they had a lot of thought about that in their deliberative process. But you have a similar thing where somebody can pitch his projects, and I imagine you all the time. The project gets too much, that if it doesn't work, the city would face a financial crisis if it doesn't work. Then the council needs to be willing to reject that project, even if it's politically popular. All right. business judgment rule. So there's kind of a presumption you're acting in good faith. You're not mean-spirited. You're not trying to hurt anybody. Good news is your decisions only have to be plausibly rational. In other words, they got to make sense. They don't have to be actually rational. They just have to make sense or seem to make sense. Okay, so you get a little protection. But reasonably informed is the key. That you're not just pulling it out of the air, not opening your board packet when you're prepare in advance. So you have financial oversight, and I say no margin, no mission. Entity, nonprofit or governmental, you need a margin because stuff happens that you didn't anticipate, and you didn't plan for, you didn't budget for, and you need it. So if you have that emergency, you need some emergency. It's all part of your policy process, right? You set the policies, strategic direction, self-assessment. I would encourage you as council members, give it a few months to get some experience. But then schedule a time on your meeting to say, how are we doing? Let's have a process discussion. Are we relating to each other in the public effectively? What things can we do to improve our performance as a council? What are the things that would make things better in our relationships with the public and our relationships with each other? This is not finger pointing. This is discovering an opportunity to make a better experience for all the council members and the public. So you could do that periodically. And then now that you're on the council, I want you to think about a succession plan. Because you've never experienced this before in many cases. But you will have some knowledge about what it takes very shortly. And you should be thinking about your replacement. Not because you're going to give up soon, but after 12 years, certainly if you get multiple terms, you will be replaced. And what you want is people that have enough knowledge to be prospective candidates to replace you. Because it could happen through illness, it could happen through job change, it could happen because you can no longer spend the time to do it, it's too burdensome, or you just get tired of it. Anything could happen. I'm reminded of a city councilman, he was a school teacher, got elected. Here's how he got elected. People said, Tommy, you ought to run. You'd be good on the city council. And he kind of quietly thought about it and said, okay, I'll do it. So he put in his application, put his name on the ballot, and then he didn't do anything. And people said, Tommy, you got a campaign. He said, well, if they know me, they'll call me if they have a question. But you got a campaign, Tommy. And he never did. He got elected anyway, because everybody knew him. He served 4 years. In fact, he was on one of my committees. At 4 years, he said, that's enough. He just didn't want to do it anymore. So think about your successor, because you want good council. And I don't care what political party they are. You want good council people. Because in local politics, political party is less meaningful than at the national level. It's about the community. It's about all the people. All right. So there's some skills, and we won't go through all these, but you want to have these abilities. You want to develop these capabilities within you, and you want to find these capabilities in your potential successors. So the first thing is to clarify your role. Make sure you're on the policy role, not operations. As a council, define how you want to be informed for issues coming on. So you and the manager should have a discussion about what that packet should have, whether you need to have briefings in advance, or how you want it presented to you as a council so you can be more effective in your decision making. You obviously want to relate to your constituencies. And if there's a problem between the council members, You're responsible for each other. That's self-discipline. My worst example was a former council member from a city that will remain unnamed. He was a bartender, owned a bar, and he promised his bar buddies free drinks if they got him elected. You think there's going to be a problem? He campaigned, no woman should be on the police department. There was a lieutenant, one woman on the police department, she was a lieutenant, let alone being a lieutenant. He got elected. First council meeting, the clerk pushes the button to turn the tape on for the mayor to call the meeting to order, and he sees a woman in the audience who says, hey babe, how about you and me getting together right here, right now? What do you say?
That can't be here. It can't be in Nevada.
It's in Nevada. It's an unnamed city, but it's in Nevada.
Can't imagine anybody being that stupid in today's day and age.
Remember his origins. So I get a call from the city manager. He says, yeah, we got a new councilman, needs some training. Came out, and he hadn't told me this story I've told you. That he didn't preface it with that. He just said, new councilman need training. So I come out and I do the training, and I said during the training, I said, if there's a constitutional violation, now sexual harassment's pretty well established as a constitutional right? If there's a constitutional violation and you're in a position of power to stop that violation, you have a duty to do that, or you could be held jointly liable with the perpetrator. And the mayor almost fell out of his chair, literally. And I knew the mayor for a long time, and I thought, something's up. So after I'm done, I'm starting to leave the room, and this lieutenant comes up to me, and she tells me how this guy campaigned and how she felt discriminated against. And I asked her, I said, does the chief support you? And she said, yes. And does the councils and manager and all those support you? And she said, yes. So I said, okay. I'm meeting with the mayor and the manager in the morning, and we will discuss what to do. And so we did. What we decided was that the council would formally admonish him on a public record that the city had policies against that, and the council members were supporting those policies, and he as a council member should be bound to those policies as much as any employee isn't bound to those policies. And they did that. And we survived his term without a lawsuit, even from the lieutenant. So it's your job to discipline each other. It's your job to hold each other accountable on the open meeting law and on the ethics law. Hold each other accountable, because that's serving the public. So I certainly don't expect to see that ever again, but it did happen. So Einstein had a definition of insanity, doing the same thing the same way and expecting different results. So when you hear the phrase, we've always done it that way, think about it from this perspective. Maybe it is insane, maybe it needs to be changed. Now this one is from Dick Clark. He's not the DJ, but Dick Clark, the former Peace Officer Standards and Training Director. And he did this in a Dealing with Difficult People class for his law enforcement. He says, conflict is neither positive nor negative. If managed properly, it's an opportunity for personal growth. Now, how many of you have thought of conflict in that way? So here's what I want you to do. When that public commenter or that fellow board member is intensely antagonistic toward you, just think inside your head, kind of smile. This is my chance to grow. All right? Because you're trying to maximize the positive, and that will calm you down. Because what happens when we're angry, according to a psychologist, this whole frontal lobe section we're not thinking anymore. We're in fight, flight, or mode. So because of that, we're not thinking. So you want to diffuse that non-thinking and get back to thinking. So we start from belief systems. This is the personal governance. Your biases, your prejudices, national things. So anything that you would pound your fist over and say, this should not happen, this isn't the way it ought to be, is probably a fundamental bias you have. Just be aware of them. Recognize your own biases. We all have them in various degrees. So when you're reacting with that kind of strength, recognize it's your belief system. And altered, but it's your belief system. Because that's where your thinking goes under stress, is to that fundamental belief system. And that's what creates the self-talk. And my self-talk is, this council member doesn't know what they're doing, and I'm not going to cooperate with them because I oppose their point of view. Guess what's going to happen at every meeting as long as I have that attitude? I'm going to be giving them a hard time, or I'm going to be reacting negatively. I may vote against something because it's them that put the motion on the floor instead of me. That's all bias stuff. So you got to be careful there. Because self-talk influences your thinking. In a sense, you program yourself. And as soon as you've had that conflict in one meeting, what are you doing on the way home? Well, that jerk. You're going through and you're ruminating on it. And then you're getting ready for the next meeting. What are you doing? You're saying, I got to see that jerk again. So you're creating, by your own self-programming, a negative experience. Shift your attitude in order to avoid that. So you can control your emotions because they're yours. You install those emotional buttons, and as much as we like to say, he pushed my buttons, truth of the matter is, I installed them. I'm the only one that can push them. He may say things that will trigger a reaction from me, but that's my belief system. That's my self-belief. And if I allow an emotional reaction to get out of control, that's on me. So we love to say, she made me do it. For those of you in the generation might remember Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it, right? So that affects your performance, it affects your behavior, and it affects the choices you make when you're not relaxed and fully engaged in a positive approach. And there's always consequences of choices. And those consequences, especially when you're in council and you're making policy decisions from that negative perspective and positive one, those are substantial and affect a lot of the city and your fellow council relationships. So when you are in that voting status of it's a 4-to-1 vote, and you were passionate about it, and I had a school board member say, brand new, he said, I got elected to make change. I said, good. I hope your bank account has money in it because you're going to need it. But he said, the rest of the board, they don't want to do it. I said, well, congratulations. Welcome to public service. This is board work. You have to seek consensus. That's the deal. And sometimes they're just not ready, as I mentioned earlier in the decision on closed litigation session. Sometimes they're just not ready. And I've had it happen on my board where one time they rejected an idea and 2 years later approved it unanimously. They just weren't ready. Wrong idea, wrong time, wrong presentation, who knows? So just remember there's consequences. And then we're back to your self-talk. So when you go out of that meeting where you lost that vote on that issue that you were passionate about, remember there's going to be another time, another issue somebody else is going to be passionate about. And you may be on the opposite side of that one. So you don't want retribution between each other because it's a collective one voice, right? So change your self-talk to a positive one. So if you have that negative experience with a fellow council member, say to yourself, you know, I'm going to give that council member the best experience the next meeting. I'm going to go out of my way to make it a positive experience so we can reestablish a good relationship, because we need each other as council members. And just talk yourself into that. And I had experience with that. I was going to a school meeting. They were not a member of our program at the time, but I was presenting our program, and I knew from staff that staff wanted the program, but the board politically said was not going to do it. And I could have taken the attitude, well, I just do a show me and walk out. You know, don't engage the board. But I didn't. I remember talking to myself as I was leaving the office. I said, take the high road, take the positive approach. They're just not ready. So I did that. 5-0 negative. I got a call the next day from the retired superintendent who said, I watched that and they screwed up. That board screwed up. They should have joined the program. They're so much better than what they have now. And I said, yeah, that's the way it goes. 2 years later, through his influence, because he did all this without my knowledge, he went behind the scenes and he started talking to those board members. And he ultimately convinced them to join, and they've been a member ever since. So it can happen. But if I'd gone in there with a negative attitude or a loser attitude, I never would have gotten to say enthusiastically all the things they were having an opportunity to get. And he probably wouldn't have been influential. So that's called moving your expectations closer to reality, which is what? Sanity. Right? And if you change your thinking, you can change the outcome, because you are the one that can be the influencer over yourself and others. So you're positive, you go from I to we. This is about the city. This is about the council members. It's a team. It's not about my personal gain. You're seeking consensus. That doesn't mean you're going to always agree, but you're always trying to find those points of agreement, points of commonality. And even when it isn't the ideal solution, you're finding the best solution that'll get the job done as necessary. You confront negativity, and what this means is you, as Dick Clark was talking about, you confront the negativity, you call it out. So if you're in a public comment situation, you got somebody antagonistic in your face, confront it in the sense of saying, you know, I want to hear what your issue is. I want to hear your solution. But all this anger and all this yelling is making it hard for me to keep my mind open. How can you rephrase it without the anger? So what that does is re-engage the thought process, which is what your goal is. It's not going to work every time, but it works in a lot of relationships where you ask yourself, and maybe ask yourself the question, why am I feeling this way? Why am I reacting this way? What is my motivation for having this negative reaction? So if you think about it from that perspective and ask yourself those open-ended questions that aren't yes, no, then you re-engage thinking, and when you re-engage thinking, you can have an actual dialogue. All right, so remain professional under pressure. Be a Leo, leave your ego out. This is not about you, it's about the people. Personal, positive, professional, productive performance. That's the goal for you as council members and committee members. So powers granted by consent of the governed. Positive governance graciously guides the people willing to be led. And I'm reminded of the New York police who turned their back on the mayor over an issue. Were they willing to be led at that moment? No. Did the mayor have power to lead them under those conditions? He lost his power. So he had to go and rebuild that relationship in order for them to follow him. So remember that as council members, the people gave you the power to make decisions on their behalf. And the people can only be led if you're willing to work with them. So Robert's rules, real quick. You're going to use your oversight. You're going to review the issues. You have your collaborative discussion of options. You're going to debate solutions. You're going to vote. That's what it's all about as council members, right? So the chair, the mayor, is the conductor of the orchestra, trying to get the instruments to play, bringing out some, suppressing others a little bit. So one of the jobs as a conductor is to say, you know, I haven't heard from this council person. Let's make sure he gets it. So one of the rules that Robert's Rules people suggest is that once you've made a comment, you wait till everyone else has made their comment before you comment a second time. It's the mayor's job to orchestrate that. So we've heard from Jim, we need to hear from Sally. You know, just go down and make sure you draw it out. So you get all those points of view. You maintain the public integrity of what you're doing, and you orchestrate the process to get a good result. You follow your agenda, and you call for motions when it's time, when the discussions seem to have ended. You call and see if anyone wants to make a motion. Okay? And if there's no motion, then you just move on. Next item. So the person who's running the meeting is a servant of the group. It's a fundamental principle in Robert's Rules. You're the conductor, but you're not the dictator. So you're the servant of the group. The group is the final authority. So the city council is the final authority, not just the leader. All members have equal rights, privileges, and obligations. So you're all equal in the council. No one may speak a second time until everyone who wishes to do so has spoken. So that's where you start making the go-round. Courtesy and respect required at all times. Again, refer to the civility document. So taking action, discussion, then there's a motion, there's a second to the motion, and then there's a vote, if there's no further discussion. So on the motions, you know, you got to clearly state what it is you're asking for, and as I said, become careful in your construction of the language, because that's your legacy, and you're going to make sure that action is clear on the record. Ask for clarification if you're not clear on what the motion is. Don't accept that all that previous discussion got distilled adequately in that motion unless it did. So ask those questions. And then you go on through the seconding process and then amendment to the motion and all that sort of thing. And again, the minute taker, don't be offended if the clerk says, clarify. I want to get it straight for the record. So after the motion is second, the chair asks for further discussion, and if there are any amendments to the motion, if none, you call for a vote. The minute taker records a vote, and the chair goes to the next item. That's straightforward under Robert's Rules, under basic ones. With the open meeting law, you again follow the law, you read the opinions from the AG to know more, be transparent, and expect civility. Make that part of your culture, a culture of civility between each other as council members or constituents. So thank you guys for they're the beneficiaries of the work that you do. And I know there's some personal satisfaction for you, but there's more to it than that. And there's a lot of people that are benefiting from all the work you do and all the hard decisions you have to make. I do have certificates here for those that want the certificate for credits under this for any purpose. So any final questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.